This video is about two special chords and their usual syntactical situations and voicings. Most people probably would say, well, that sounds a lot like Romantic or later 19th century stuff. What if I told you that this chord was already pretty much en vogue in the Baroque era, and this may come as a surprise to you, not exclusively in experimental pieces of visionary composers that allegedly operated ahead of their time anticipating later styles. It rather more seems like that this kind of chords were already part of figured bass manuals teaching standard contemporary chord grammar. All materials and exercises you'll see in the video are available on my Patreon site. But let's begin with Strauss. One of Strauss' most popular songs is without any doubt the final piece of his Opus 27, due to that yawning and melancholy atmosphere that seems to capture the spirit and sentiment of the turn of the century compressed in 2 pages of sheet music. The special thing about it is an extensive piano intro where time seems to stand still and a certain iconic chord is being exposed 2 times, which makes this piece one of the most fancy and corny pieces of that era. Let's listen in for a bit. Now let's check out those chords. I know that there's people that just go for the chord's interval structure, and as first step this definitely makes sense. So there is a major 7th chord with an augmented 5th, and the one down below the same but expanded through an additional 9th. And as far as I can observe the music theory bubble of the internet, many people would seem to be already happy with that kind of analysis. So that's sort of jazz chords. Strauss was an early jazz cat. Case closed. Well, not for me. I just want to dig a little deeper. Recognizing the sheer structure of a chord is, if anything, the first step. Understanding a chord is to have an idea about its use and its implied syntactical situations, which means to understand where, when, and how to put it exactly. When I listen to this music, I conceive this one not even as autonomous chord. I can hear and see that this chord resolves like multiple suspensions to related chord tones of an A minor 6th chord. And the upper part of the chord, apart from the bass note, pretty much looks like the dominant 7th of A minor. And it seems to me that the spaced voicing contributes a lot to the sound of this chord in general. Let's look at an example of this chord that was composed 90 years prior to that, and that'll illuminate all this a little. In this one, the generation of the chord is pretty obvious, as it directly emerges from the secondary dominant, simply by raising the bass by step, when the chord above pretty much just remains the same. Just the resolution is different to the Strauss example, as the bass note drops to the root, and you better keep this bass motion in mind for later. In both shown examples, the chord occurs as kind of a precadential chord sitting on the 4th degree of the major scale. 2 times the chord was introduced by stepwise bass motion, and the resolution was followed up by the 5. Although this progression is kind of a fancy one, to a certain degree it was definitely a standard device in a composer's repertoire to be put on the table on special occasions and when the time is right. For example, in the final bars of Schumann's Arabesque. To stage a little highlight before the final cadence, Schumann pulls out the chord, but in this case without the ninth, just the raised fifth and the major seventh, that resolve like leading tones. Instead of introducing the chord by step as seen in the previous examples, Schumann uses it as part of a simple 1-4-5-1 cadence. Let's listen to a Baroque piece that shows a final very similar to the previous Schumann example. I think it's fascinating how two pieces composed over 100 years apart from each other and that represent completely different eras of musical styles can have so much specific detail in common. Obviously, both composers wanted to give the final cadence a special spice, and both went for the sonority exploiting the augmented fifth. So just from Couperin to Strauss, this sonority seems to have a long lifespan of 176 years. That's spectacular. Almost even more spectacular to me was to learn that as a matter of fact, these chords have already been subject of early 18th century figured bass manuals, especially in France. In Dandrieux's now well-known little book, you can find a page where he describes the chord structure and its general treatment. He writes, "The augmented fifth goes along with the seventh or the ninth, depending on the situation and the position of the hand. The seventh or the ninth can be left out. The chord can usually be found on the third degree of a minor scale and is indicated via the sharp fifth." Well, isn't this a little different from what I've told you in the first place? Let's take a basic example to clarify this. This example shows a clear F major cadence with the sixth chord as precadential standard, the secondary dominant. Introducing that fancy chord in terms of 18th century theory would have been perceived as a local change of key, with the F sharp indicating G minor as the local scale, and from this perspective the augmented fifth chord is sitting on the local third degree, although when that chord resolves into the regular sixth chord, this one can and should as well be seen as part of the subsequent F major cadence. I guess that's all gonna become a lot clearer when we take a look at one of the original examples by Dandrieux that are less complex and remain unmistakably in a single key. Do you remember this bass line that drops to the root when the chord resolves? That's exactly like in the Hummel prelude I showed you. I have to admit that I'm not so much a fan of the Dandrieux examples as they somehow lack a certain design quality. I want to practice this chord with a characteristic spaced voicing, like in the following example that could be taken as transposable exercise. The augmented fifth chord can as well be introduced via the 4-2 chord of the dominant, and in this one I'm omitting the ninth, which makes a closer voicing but still sounds fancy. And now this progression is gonna be part of a more stylized exercise, targeting at this kind of Fantasia style textures where you freely arpeggiate those thick chord packages. First the chords. And now Fantasia style. and that's gonna become a transposing exercise that modulates constantly a fifth up. Welcome to the geek section, as I still have some leftovers, and you probably know, sometimes those can be really tasty. Let's begin with a nice example by J.S. Bach, as he obviously was a huge fan of that chord as well. The excerpt is taken from his early Toccata in D minor and shows a phase of intensification close to the end of the piece, where the chord with the augmented fifth takes part in generating the harmonic tension. The other example I want to show is again by François Couperin, and in this one it's becoming really serious, as he seemingly wants to create a somewhat dark and sublime atmosphere. Once more, the chord occurs as intended highlight close to the end. Let's listen. And for the Partimento geeks, in this one, the generation of the augmented fifth chord can be seen as an add-on that enriches a common 7/6 suspension. Again, the original situation. Three-voice scaffolding. Enriched with chords. So that really does it for this episode, I guess. If you made it up to here, you're definitely a nerd, so consider to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next video then. Cheers!